I'm going to talk a little bit today around the importance of youth competition on long-term athlete development, and I think reinforce some of the messages from a research perspective of what you've just seen there. I think Scott's presentation was great and talked a lot about what I'm going to show you, and those two videos that we saw were very good examples of the applied practice of what I'm going to relay today. So just to start with, I'm actually based here at Birmingham City University. So I say here, we're actually based in the Alexander Stadium now, which is great. I'm the director of the Research for Athlete and Youth Sport Development Lab, which is essentially a research group that works with industry partners to really try and create evidence-informed structures and organisational settings so every young athlete can achieve their potential. So I think it really resonates with some of the messages that I've heard here today. We've got our core values there and our guiding principles that we use, but our mission and vision is very much around trying to support every athlete. We do work with lots of industry partners, so most notably we do work with FIFA and their talent development scheme. We're also supporting the ECB to support the recommendations of their recent ICC report as well. But I've never done any research in England athletics, so it's been great listening to some of your stories, and hopefully I can share some of my experiences so we can learn from each other as well. So before I start, and this story is quite pertinent to some of the messages that I'm going to share, but very similar to you lot, you've probably got your own journeys and own stories, which is why you got into sport in the first place and where you are today. So this is my under 14 Exeter City Academy, or Centre of Excellence it was called back then, squad photo. This guy here. Yes, that is me. I wasn't sure if you'd be able to get me because I've definitely blossomed since then. Terrible barnet and quite pale, but you could probably see within this single age group structure at under 14s, there's lots of different boys that are at different biological ages. And I was certainly a later developer. You can see the front row particular. And you can also see the back row, you've probably got more of the earlier developers. At under 16s, I was actually released for being too small to make it, which is a bit of a story that's common throughout the examples I'm going to show you, but I was going to be too small to be a professional football player apparently. But I did actually achieve a professional contract at the age of 22 at Salisbury City, so I was there for a couple of years, but had a relatively successful non-league career. I stopped playing last year actually at 36, so my long-term participation in the sport was really strong as well. We also have this lad here, which is another example. So this is Aaron Pugh. And again, he's had this long-term participation in the sport. He's now the academy manager at Exeter, at the club he was once released from. But he was also told he was going to be too small to make it. But he actually turned out to be a 6'7" centre-half. So surprisingly, the coaches got that wrong in terms of being too small to be a professional football player. So again, Aaron had a really successful non-league career playing at the likes of Truro City, Dorchester Town and other clubs. And then the last example I've got here is another player here. I don't know if is there any Blues fans or Birmingham City fans? Do you recognise that lad?
We don't have him here.
No. So that's George Friend. So he was recently at the Blues. I think he was only there for a couple of years, but he actually went on to play in the Premier League for Middlesbrough, where he was captain of their side. But he was also told he was going to be too small to be a professional football player. But he continued playing with the youth team at under 18s and all of a sudden made his way through, then got sold on to Wolves and then slowly made it from there. And all the players who got offered scholarships were surprisingly the players along the top, or the bigger, more mature players, where these three players who were released actually played at a higher level than those. So if you think about youth sport, talent identification development, even at the ages of 16 where players are being selected, coaches don't get it right. And I appreciate this was probably, over 20 years ago now. But if we can't get it right at these ages, then at under 10s, under 12s, there's no point identifying and selecting talent because we're so far off the end point. So what we want to try and do is think about how can we create settings for as many as possible, for as long as possible, so then at the end point, we then get the best players out of that, not just from a performance perspective, but participation and personal development. So that links in nicely to this framework that I'm going to show you, which essentially talks about athlete development across different timescales. So we've been fortunate enough to work with Jean Cote at Queen's University in Canada quite closely. And this is the framework based upon a lot of his research. So if we think about athlete development across different timescales, we obviously have long-term athlete development. So long-term athlete development, the first P I'm going to talk to you about is performance. So yes, we want to create organizational structures and settings to create the best performers we possibly can, because we want to be top of the medal charts, we want to be top performers within our country. But we know athletes, there's only a very small proportion of them that are going to make it. So we also want to make sure that we're emphasizing long-term participation within our sport, creating a lifelong engagement within a specific sport is really important. So how can we create structures to ensure athletes stay in sport? And then our last P is personal development, because of course, if these athletes are engaged in our sport, it's not just about performance and participation, we want to develop good people as well. So how are we creating structures that create good people within our sport? So that's where we come to our immediate youth sport experiences. So in order to get these long-term outcomes, how do we actually create competition structures that create these right environments? So we essentially have these three dynamic elements that are three different cogs. So our first cog up here is personal engagement in activities. So this is the what. So how are we creating competitive engineered structures that meet the athlete's needs? So there was a great example there about how they modify the games that the athletes are engaging in to meet the individual's needs. Scott talked a little bit more around some other different bits and pieces in terms of how many activities are they actually engaging in when they turn up to these competitions. So it's really important we think about what that looks like. The second part is this appropriate settings and organizational structures. So this is the where. So there was, again, on the video that Scott showed, there was talk around rural areas, or really rural areas. So how are we creating opportunities for athletes to engage in athletics? How are we drawing them into the sport? And then the last one is the quality social dynamics. So we had a good talk on our table this morning around the implications of athletics being an individual sport. So how can we foster positive group dynamics and relationships within an individual sport? So it's quite a difficult environment to create. We also want to think about how we involve other stakeholders like parents and coaches. So if we create these three dynamic elements accordingly, you get this outcome of fun and engagement for the athletes. So if we create fun and engagement, we're going to get these short-term outcomes over a season. So we think about a year's long-term development. And we call these personal assets. So we have competence. So competence is essentially where you're getting better at that sport. So we're developing faster athletes, athletes you can throw further. So you're really seeing individual progress. The second one is confidence. So we know the more confident athletes are engaging in sport, the longer they're going to participate and engage in things like smart goals, goal setting. The next one is connection. So I mentioned there around I'm still friends with Aaron Pugh, one of the players. So I've developed lifelong friendships through the sport, and some of you probably have got friends that you still chat to now of kids that you grew up with playing. But also connections with coaches and developing or integrating parents within the process. And the last one is character. And I appreciate character might mean different things to different people, but we're really thinking about the integrity of the sport and developing good people as well. So if we create real positive environments for the athletes that are age appropriate, as well as involving the relevant stakeholders, we will develop these personal assets over the short term, which will inevitably lead to these long-term outcomes of better performers, more participation, and increased personal development. So for my final slide, I'm just going to show you 10 recommendations from Cote and Hancock, who essentially highlight some of the recommendations that youth sport policymakers should integrate into their programs when developing competition structures. So I won't go through all 10 here, but all of these are evidence-based. They're informed by research. So just to re-emphasize some of the key points in terms of kids under the age of 13 should really focus on lots of different activities. And I guess athletics is in a unique position where, although you've got England athletics, there's already lots of different activities within a single sport, which is fantastic. But I guess one of the things that we could emphasize is the limiting of lengthy travel to organize competitions. So ensuring kids stay engaged within the sport, not traveling long distances or having long days where they're sitting not necessarily doing much. Perhaps 2 or 3 activities throughout a 6-7 hour day isn't going to lead to long-term participation. So thinking about how much kids are traveling, but also the amount they're actually engaging in activities during those days that they do travel. The next one I've highlighted here is providing healthy competition or healthy competitive environments, but not to overemphasize winning or the long-term outcomes such as championships. So perhaps focusing on individual performances through things like personal bests or growth within those teams could be really important compared to who is going to be the fastest in the race. Because particularly at under 12s or under 10s, we know that those who are born at the first part of the year or those who are the most mature within the group are the ones who are going to win the races. So really focus on those who have the potential to develop longer term rather than who is good at that moment in time. And then the last one I've highlighted is designing play and practice activities that focus on fun and short-term rewards. So linked a little bit to what I said there, but perhaps thinking about how you can integrate play and fun within your games or competitions rather than focusing on who wins and who is the best at that moment. But all of these will be on the slides that I shared afterwards, so you could take a look through and maybe think about what are you already doing that is good and useful, but perhaps what other ones might you be able to integrate into your current structures. So appreciate that was a really quick talk, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the different timescales and the impact of short-term developmental outcomes on long-term developmental outcomes and the different things that you could consider within your structures.